April 8, 1943. Over Caen, France, at an altitude of 27,000 feet. The oxygen mask covered his face, but it couldn't hide Oberlieutenant Ralph Hermachen's smile. From the crystal-clear canopy of his F-190A5, he observed the jagged silhouettes slowly climbing and approaching their own squadrons. This experienced ace pilot of Jagdgeschwader 26 was witnessing American fighters engage in their first real battle over occupied Europe. "They've sent us flying milk bottles," he quipped to his wingman. He tried not to laugh as he watched the rather large P-47 Thunderbolts struggle to gain altitude. 16 P-47Cs from the 4th Fighter Group were climbing in tight formation. Their 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 engines strained to lift their 7-ton fuselages. To German pilots accustomed to the grace of the Spitfire and the agility of Soviet fighters, these massive American planes seemed like bizarre caricatures. Ship-like fuselages, huge propellers, tiny wings. But what Hermachen didn't know that day, what no German pilot there could even imagine, was this. They were witnessing the arrival of the weapon that would systematically destroy the Luftwaffe's fighter force. 18 months later, these flying milk jugs would no longer be a laughing matter. The sound of 8 12.7mm Browning machine guns firing would become one of the things German pilots feared most. The destruction hidden behind those wide wings was already there. 3,400 rounds, 6,000 rounds per minute, enough firepower to riddle a Messerschmitt with holes in less than 2 seconds. And the transformation began that very morning. Major Donald Blakesley, commander of the 335th Fighter Squadron, spotted the German formation moving into attack position. An experienced pilot who had switched from RAF Spitfires to the Thunderbolt just weeks earlier, he knew something his men did not yet realize. Surviving in the P-47 required abandoning old air combat rules and adopting a new mindset. The Thunderbolt was a departure from the classic fighter design philosophy. While the Germans were trying to design light, agile fighters with strong climb performance, Republic Aviation had created a completely different beast. A high-altitude giant that would rewrite the rules of war using power, mass, and a hail of fire. Among the 56 American pilots flying on the French side that morning were the aces of the future. But on that day, they were all novices. The Germans, on the other hand, had been fighting since 1939, had seen action on every front from Poland to Russia, and had years of experience. For the Americans, it was day zero of the war. The story of the P-47 Thunderbolt began in those panic-stricken days of June 1940. As German fighters swept the skies over France, an urgent request was sent to Alexander Kartveli, the Georgian-born chief designer at Republic Aviation. "We need a powerful high-altitude interceptor capable of taking on the Luftwaffe's best fighters." Kartveli heard this request and envisioned something completely different. A giant that disregarded all rules, redefining what we call possible. He turned to his design team and said one sentence: "This will be a dinosaur, but a well-proportioned dinosaur." When the XP-47B prototype took off on May 6, 1941, everyone was shocked. The aircraft was truly gigantic. Its empty weight was 9,900 pounds, a full 65% heavier than the previous model, the P-43 Lancer. The pipes running through the rear fuselage due to the massive turbo supercharger gave the aircraft a strange, pregnant appearance. The only question in the minds of the test pilots who saw the aircraft for the first time was, does this thing actually fly? And yes, it did. And it performed better than anyone expected at high altitudes. Its 18-cylinder, 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R280 engine didn't lose power even at 27,000 feet. At the same altitude, German fighter engines were struggling, but the XP-47B remained powerful and agile. Its exhaust-driven turbo supercharger system continued to provide the engine with sea-level power even at altitudes where normal superchargers ran out of breath. Major Hubert Hub Zemke, responsible for training the 56th Fighter Group, America's first P-47 unit, did not like the aircraft at first. Just think, between September 1942 and January 1943, 18 pilots and 41 aircraft, all lost in training accidents. In the early months of the war, the P-47 caused more problems for American pilots than for the Germans. Because it easily skidded off the runway during landing. It tended to roll onto its wing during takeoff due to engine torque. And when diving, it accelerated so rapidly that pilots encountered a problem called compressibility for the first time, where shock waves locked up the controls. But those who truly knew the plane soon noticed something extraordinary. This massive metal contraption became a beast when it got its hands on power. Robert Johnson, a farm boy from Oklahoma who would go on to score 27 victories, described his first P-47 flight like this. It was like being tied to a locomotive. The power was unbelievable. You weren't flying the plane, you were just steering it. The first real combat engagements in April and May 1943 seemed to confirm the Germans' dismissive views of the P-47. The P-47 couldn't keep up with the FW-190s in turns, lagged behind the Bf-110s in climbs, and couldn't match the Germans' agility at medium altitudes. German pilots quickly developed a tactic to exploit this, making fast attacks from below, then engaging in agile turn-and-dive combat. After the first encounter, Joseph Pips Preeler, commander of GG-26, wrote, "The new American fighter is like a butchered animal. It flies like a truck, turns like a freight train, climbs like a pregnant cow." Young pilots even nicknamed it Indiana among themselves, a heavy target pretending to be a fighter. The statistics also showed that things were not going well. In the first month, the Americans lost 14 P-47s and shot down only 3 German planes. Even RAF pilots were mocking the Americans. The best escape maneuver in a P-47: get out of the cockpit and run.
But amid all this mockery, there was one thing the Germans overlooked. The P-47 wasn't easy to kill, and it didn't like dying either. On a Thunderbolt returning from a mission, 21 20mm cannon holes, over 100 machine gun marks. Most planes would have been torn apart in the air with half this damage. But the P-47's radial engine was so robust that it continued to run, seemingly ignoring all these blows. And when this plane's machine guns locked onto an enemy, the result was no longer a fall, but annihilation. An incident near Le Mans, France on June 26, 1943 completely changed both American and German perceptions of the P-47. Second Lieutenant Robert S. Johnson, a young pilot from the 61st Fighter Squadron, was flying back with a group of 48 P-47s. At that moment, 16 FW-190s from Jagdgeschwader 26, under the command of Wilhelm Ferdinand Wutz-Galland, dove from the sun and attacked. The Germans had planned the attack very well. Johnson's P-47 was suddenly under fire from several FW-190s and within seconds turned into a death trap. 21 20mm cannon shells pierced the fuselage. The cockpit canopy shattered. Hydraulic fluid sprayed onto his face and clothing. The engine cowling flew off. The instrument panel caught fire. Johnson was wounded in the leg. He wanted to bail out, but there was a problem. A 20mm shell had bent and jammed the canopy rail. There was no way out. At 27,000 feet, he was completely trapped inside a severely damaged aircraft. But then, something incredible happened. Despite being unable to see anything in the oil-covered cockpit, Johnson managed to correct the plane and turn it toward England. The P-47 was still flying, despite damage that would have caused other planes to break apart in midair. But then came the second disaster. A lone FW-190 pilot flying in German airspace, whose identity remains unknown to this day, mistook this battered P-47 for a simple aircraft. Johnson was unable to maneuver. He could only curl up in his seat and pray. The German pilot emptied his remaining 20mm ammunition into Johnson. The P-47 still didn't fall. This time, he switched to machine guns and attacked again. The P-47 still didn't go down. It was still flying, still intact. The German pilot flew up beside him in astonishment. Johnson could clearly see the expression on his face. Astonishment, amazement, a kind of respectful fear. The pilot emptied all his remaining ammunition into the P-47, but still couldn't bring the plane down. Finally, the German pilot, out of ammunition, flew away. When the plane landed at Manston, the engine completely collapsed on the runway and the Thunderbolt came to a halt on the ground. The technicians stopped counting the holes after 200. One shell had passed just a few inches from Johnson's head. Another had pierced the armor behind the seat. The engine had been hit multiple times. 3 main spars of the fuselage had been completely perforated. But still, the plane had brought its pilot home. This incident had a shocking effect on both sides. Even American engineers realized they had underestimated the P-47's durability. German intelligence still couldn't believe the reports. "A plane with this much damage can't fly," they said. But the truth was clear. The Thunderbolt was far beyond what a fighter plane could withstand. By July 1943, American pilots had finally begun to understand how to use the P-47. Fighter Group Commander Lieutenant Colonel Hub Zemke, through both training losses and painful experience, distilled this simple but golden rule. Don't turn with them. Climb low. Use your weight. Use your power. Use your guns. In short, use the Thunderbolt according to your own game, not the Germans' game. What initially seemed like a disadvantage, the weight, was actually the P-47's greatest weapon. Because when it dove, this weight accelerated the plane so much that no German fighter could keep up. A Thunderbolt diving from 30,000 feet, it could reach speeds of 550 miles per hour. This speed was even faster than the maximum speed of German fighters. Gathering this speed, the P-47 would open the throttle and climb steeply at the end of the dive, leaving German planes far behind, because at those altitudes, their engines were already exhausted. One of the pilots who best utilized this new concept of energy warfare was Captain Walker Bud Maharan. Maharan systematized the P-47's famous tactic: dive, shoot, climb. The pilots themselves gave it a more playful name: Thunderbolt Turkey Shoot. The tactic was simple but deadly. Climb up to above 30,000 feet in formation, turn around when you see the Germans below, dive, open fire with the 8 Browning guns when you get close, and climb again as soon as the target falls. Ferdinand 90 pilots described this machine gun rain using just 2 words: bullet wall. Planes hitting this wall didn't just fall, they literally shattered in midair. And the P-47's power was most clearly demonstrated on August 17, 1943, during that major bombing mission over Schweinfurt and Regensburg.
That day, P-47s led by Major David Schilling descended upon heavily armed Messerschmitt Bf-110s, preparing to attack a B-17 squadron. Bf-110 gunner Kurt Roth later described the event. "The American fighters were like hammers falling from the sky. I fired from 800 meters. My bullets hit, but the P-47 didn't react at all. Then they fired. The lead plane vanished instantly. It didn't fall, it literally shattered. The wing flew one way, the tail another. The cockpit turned into metal dust. The Bf-110 was gone in 2 seconds. Within a minute, 8 more Bf-110s and Bf-109s suffered the same fate. Each P-47's weapon load was literally a flying arsenal. 8 times 12.7 mm Browning machine guns, 3,400 rounds, 6,000 rounds per minute. Point of convergence, 1.8 meter kill zone. The fate of aircraft entering this zone was clear. They didn't fall. They vanished instantly. The generosity of American production in terms of ammunition was in a league of its own. While German fighters had limited cannon ammunition, 120 to 200 rounds, American P-47 pilots could fire continuously for 30 seconds. This was a huge amount of time in aerial combat. And the mix of Browning ammunition, armor-piercing, incendiary, armor-piercing incendiary tracer, standard rounds. They pierced the structure, burned it, and melted the enemy in seconds. American ace Gabby Gabreski said, "When 8 guns hit at once, the enemy plane doesn't just fall, it explodes. I saw a Bf-109 torn to pieces. The pilot didn't even have time to understand what was happening." By September 1943, the Germans began to realize something disturbing. The P-47 was literally king at high altitudes. Its turbo-supercharged double Wasp engine could deliver full power even above 30,000 feet. German fighters, however, were literally gasping for air at these altitudes because they had single-stage or at most 2-stage mechanical superchargers. Above 25,000 feet, German aircraft were essentially running in mud. This difference cost the life of Hans Philipp, one of the Luftwaffe's famous aces. On October 8, 1943, Philipp was attacking B-17s at 28,000 feet when his FW-190A6 engine began to lose power in the thin air. The BMW 801 engine was literally gasping for breath. Just then, the P-47s of the 56th Fighter Group dove from 32,000 feet. Robert Johnson described the moment. "I fired from 300 yards, 30 degrees deflection. I saw the hits all over the fuselage. The enemy plane exploded in mid-air." Philipp's death had a chilling effect on the Germans. If even a fighter ace with 206 victories and hundreds of sorties couldn't stand up to the P-47, the others had no chance. The report given to Hermann Göring in November 1943 was like a news bulletin of chaos. P-47 ceiling altitude, 42,000 plus feet. Dive speed, close to the speed of sound. Armor protection, extremely high. Can fly even if the engine is hit. Incredibly sturdy fuselage. And the most striking sentence: "This aircraft can sustain damage that would destroy 3 fighter planes and still return." During this period, the Americans began to introduce a new model into service. The P-47D-22, the famous version with wide wings and a paddle blade propeller. This giant 13-foot diameter propeller completely transformed the Thunderbolt's previously weak climb performance. Previous models, 2,200 feet climb per minute. New paddle blade P-47, 3,000 feet climb per minute.
They were now equal to the German fighters, even better at some altitudes. Their horizontal acceleration had increased dramatically. The German pilots didn't understand this at first. Heinz Knoke of JG-11 near Hanover summed it up perfectly. "The fat American fighters have learned to climb. We dove into formation, expecting our usual superiority, but they climbed with us. We tried to break away. They followed us. Even at 30,000 feet, they didn't fall behind. Schmidt was caught and torn apart in the air. Only metal fragments remained behind. These weren't the planes we had laughed at last year." The new propeller changed not only the performance, but also the sound. The P-47 now came with a deep, resonant roar that could be recognized from afar. The German army gave this sound a name: Donnerschlag, thunderclap. By March 1944, P-47s, thanks to external fuel tanks, could accompany bombers deep into Germany. When the tanks were jettisoned, the Thunderbolt returned to full power, and the sky became a veritable no-fly zone for German fighters. The Luftwaffe's only response was brief. Instead of dealing with the P-47s, they would go straight for the bombers. But they couldn't reach them without getting past the cover above. Who were the planes providing that cover? The Thunderbolts, of course. That's why German pilots now looked at the P-47 not with scorn, but with a mixture of fear and respect. During this period, the famous German ace Gunther Rall was seriously wounded in a clash with P-47s on March 6, 1944. Years later, he would describe that day as follows: "We saw their huge silhouettes against the sun. Someone laughed, 'Flying pigs!' But 30 seconds later, no one was laughing. They descended on us like an avalanche from the sky. 3 of our planes were turned into fireballs on the first dive. We fired at short intervals. Their machine guns, however, were a relentless stream of death. Anyone caught in that stream was instantly destroyed." By the spring of 1944, the P-51 Mustang had begun to take over long-range missions. This completely changed the P-47's playing field. The Thunderbolt was now a hunter-bomber beast that would rain death from the sky. As effective as the 8 Browning machine guns were in the air, they were at least twice as devastating on the ground. From above, 50 caliber bullets were like cutting butter with a hot knife for German vehicles with weak armor. In a 2-second burst, 160 12.7mm rounds, enough to devastate an area the size of a truck. But the real transformation came when the P-47 began to carry bombs and rockets. The P-47 D-25 model could now carry 2 1,000-pound bombs under the wings, 1 500-pound bomb under the fuselage. That's a total explosive payload equivalent to an old medium bomber. Then, when 10 5-inch Havar rockets were added, each rocket had the impact of a 105mm artillery shell. A single salvo was devastating for an armored unit. Oberst Hans von Luck, commander of the 125th Panzergrenadier Regiment in Normandy, described seeing the P-47. "They were flying so low we could see the pilots' faces. The engine noise was terrifying. The rockets screamed towards us. Then came the hammering of the machine guns. One of our convoys was wiped out in a single pass. 20 vehicles were reduced to ashes. The soldiers' morale collapsed at that moment."
The Germans called this type of attack aircraft Jabo, Jagdbomber. But the P-47 was something else in their minds: a flying artillery battery. And on June 6, 1944, D-Day, the P-47's famous ground attack capability was fully utilized for the first time. During the Normandy invasion, over 500 P-47s formed a shield in the sky. When German fighters tried to approach the beaches, they were literally cut down. Oberlieutenant Wolfgang Fischer of JG-2 said, "The sky belonged entirely to the Americans. Thunderbolts were lined up in layers from sea level up to 30,000 feet. At dawn, we tried to get through with 12 planes. Only I returned. They had ambushes at every altitude. You couldn't go above them, you couldn't go below them. Their guns turned our planes into an aluminum rain." In June alone, the damage inflicted by P-47s on the ground was incredible. 651 locomotives, 3,847 trucks, 512 tanks and armored vehicles, 4,553 horse-drawn carts. It became nearly impossible for the Wehrmacht to move in daylight. German officers' reports frequently included the phrase, "The sky belongs to the Americans by day, the land to us by night." But the P-47 had rendered daytime operations ineffective. While storming through Europe, the P-47 was also proving itself in the Pacific. The 348th Fighter Group, serving in New Guinea, discovered that the Thunderbolt was surprisingly well suited to tropical weather, high humidity, long distances, and harsh conditions. The group's commander, Colonel Neil Kirby, had fallen in love with the P-47 and developed entirely new tactics for it. What Kirby did on October 11, 1943, was almost unbelievable. With only 4 P-47s, he attacked 40 Japanese aircraft. He shot down 6 planes in a single mission and received the Medal of Honor for it.
Japanese pilots couldn't believe what they saw in their first encounters. They were used to relatively fragile American fighters like the P-40, but the P-47 was another creature altogether. The famous Japanese ace, Saburo Sakai, described his encounter with the P-47 in New Guinea as follows. "We called them monsters. Our 20mm cannons would destroy a P-40 with just a few hits. But I fired dozens of rounds at the Thunderbolt, and it just kept flying. Their return fire was terrifying. Heavy shells sliced through the plane."
Pacific missions required long ranges, and the Thunderbolt changed significantly in this regard. The model specially developed for the Pacific, P-47N. The difference in this model was enormous. Wet wing-type fuel tanks were added inside the wings, 93 gallons of extra fuel. Total flight range increased to 2,350 miles. This allowed the P-47N to escort B-29 Superfortresses all the way to Japan. The short-range fat fighter that was ignored in 1943 had become the monster of the Pacific by 1945. And then, in the final stages of the war, the P-47 faced the world's first operational jet fighters, Messerschmitt Me-262. On paper, no propeller-driven aircraft could compete with a jet. Jets flew at 540 miles per hour. For that era, they were like aircraft from the future. But in reality, things were a bit different. Jets were very slow during takeoff and landing. The P-47, however, was almost as fast as the jets when diving from high altitude. On November 27, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer became one of the first P-47 pilots to shoot down a Mesh 262. He descended from 28,000 feet, approached 500 miles per hour, and caught up with the jet. His report stated, "The enemy aircraft broke apart under fire. The engines separated from the fuselage. The pilot could not escape. The intense fire from 8 Browning guns was much more effective against jets than we had anticipated." Later, a special model was developed specifically for hunting jets, P-47M, 2,800 horsepower with water methanol injection, 470 miles per hour at 30,000 feet, enough power to chase V-1 rockets and Mesh 262s. In March 1945, Major George Bostwick shot down 2 Mesh 262s with this model. The technical report stated, "The jets are faster, but cannot maneuver or withstand our fire. A single accurate burst from us tears the jet's fuselage like a paper bag." As 1945 approached, the Germans decided to play their last big card. Launched on the morning of January 1st, Operation Bodenplatte was a huge gamble by the Luftwaffe to destroy Allied air bases in a surprise raid. More than 900 German fighters took off at dawn with the last resources of the war. But the result was a complete disaster for the German side.
Especially at the Y-34, Metz, Air Base, the P-47s of the 365th Fighter Group were caught on the ground by the raid. 22 Thunderbolts were destroyed in an instant. Seeing the burning planes, a German pilot asked mockingly, "What do you say to that?" The response from base commander, Major George Brooking, summed up the war. "Tomorrow there will be 40 new P-47s here. How long does it take you to replace your pilots?" This remark became legendary in the 9th Air Force, because 2 days later, 40 new P-47s had arrived at the airbase. The toll at Bodenplatte was brutal. German losses: 271 aircraft, 213 pilots, never to be replaced. American losses: 134 aircraft, fully replenished within a week. This event revealed another truth. The war was no longer just in the air, but also between factories. And America was unrivaled in this war. 15,683 P-47s were produced. This was the highest production of single-engine fighters in American history. The Republic factory in Farmingdale was so efficient that it could produce 1 P-47 per hour. The Indiana Evansville facilities had reached a monthly production capacity of 500 aircraft. Inside a P-47D, 65,000 separate parts, 8 miles of electrical cable, 900 kilograms of aluminum, 136 kilograms of rubber, 2,400 components in its engine. And all of this was assembled, mostly with extraordinary speed and attention, by workers who had never seen an airplane before the war. Each P-47 sortie required 3,400 .50 caliber rounds. The monthly consumption of just the 9th Air Force in mid-1944 was 10 million .50 caliber bullets. Lake City Arsenal alone produced 30 million per month. These bullets were manufactured with such high quality that even a system firing 6,000 rounds per minute did not jam. Fuel was another crazy thing. The P-47 used 300 gallons of fuel per hour at combat power. The 9th Air Force's monthly fuel requirement was 25 million gallons. All of this fuel was transported by tankers. American industry was operating like a giant machine. So much so that every lost P-47 was immediately replaced, and pilots never faced a shortage of aircraft. For the Germans, however, every loss was fatal. Once an aircraft was gone, it was gone. If a pilot died, there was no replacement.
The Americans had established the formula for devastating results. Unlimited resources, plus disciplined training, plus high-quality aircraft. The power of the P-47 was evident, but looking at how the war was actually won makes it clearer. The results of the pilot training gap. By 1944, America was training 30,000 new pilots per year. This was an incredible number, more than Germany trained during the entire war. Before an American P-47 pilot went to war, 400-plus hours of flight training, 100 hours of advanced fighter training, deflection shooting, shooting at a moving target, firing live ammunition at towed targets, flight film analysis, instrument flight, combat tactics in formation. In short, he was stepping onto the front lines as an experienced pilot. At the same time, the situation for German pilots was dire. The total training of a German pilot sent to war at the end of 1944, 80 to 100 hours. In the final months of the war, this number fell below 50 hours. This was not enough time to properly learn the aircraft. An American pilot, on the other hand, was sent to the front with 6 times more training during the same period. P-47 pilot Lieutenant Eugene Roberts described this disparity as follows. I had 420 hours of flight training. I had flown 75 hours in the P-47 and fired hundreds of rounds. When I went on my first mission, I knew what to do. It was obvious that the German pilot I faced had less than half my experience. It wasn't a fair fight. By March 1945, Josef Priller, who had mocked the Thunderbolt 2 years earlier, had come to accept the truth. In an interview filmed for propaganda purposes, he couldn't help but say, "The Thunderbolt is the best fighter bomber ever built. Its firepower is incredible. Its weapons never jam. Its ammunition never runs out. It carries as many bombs as a medium bomber. It fires rockets like an artillery piece. If necessary, it fights like a fighter." But Priller's most striking words were not about the machine, but about America. The real issue is not the aircraft. The power behind the machine, unlimited American production. When the Germans lost an aircraft, it was lost forever. The Americans, however, could lose 10 aircraft and bring in 20 new ones the next day. And the pilots. When German pilots died, there were no replacements. When American pilots died, trained, fully equipped new pilots immediately took their place. Priller finally made this confession. Our strength was courage. Their strength was their resources. Without resources, courage is just a delayed defeat.
His most important statement was this. In 1943, we laughed. In 1945, hearing the sound of a P-47 made your blood run cold. Most of those who heard that sound never made it home.
By April 1945, the Luftwaffe still looked like an air force on paper, but in reality, it was completely finished. No fuel, no experienced pilots, most planes wrecked, half the airfields bombed, the remaining planes lacking parts. But the real problem had to be understood not in numbers, but in terms of the sky. Mathematically, their survival was now impossible. When a German pilot took off, he faced this reality. There were P-47s at every altitude between 0 and 40,000 feet. A Thunderbolt could have been lying in wait at every level. There was nowhere to escape, nowhere to hide, nowhere to breathe. Towards the end of the war, young German pilot Feldwebel Klaus Brettschneider described his only combat mission. 4 Thunderbolts dove on us at once. I tried to turn, but they were too fast. The leader fired from 500 meters. My plane shook as if it had been hit by a sledgehammer. The engine exploded, the wing broke off. As I descended by parachute, I looked down. In 12 seconds, our entire squadron had been wiped out. This was no longer aerial combat. This was a hunt. And the psychological trauma caused by this hunt was so great that a special diagnosis was added to German medical reports: Yabo fever, meaning fear of fighter bombers. When the sound of the P-47 was heard, pilots experienced panic, fear, stomach cramps, trembling, cold sweat, increased heart rate, loss of sense of direction. German pilots who normally remained calm even when seeing a Spitfire or Hurricane did not know what to expect when they saw the P-47's dive speed and firepower. A sentence from a doctor's report explains this better. The sound of the P-47's engine causes instant paralysis even in experienced pilots. The total impact of the P-47 in Europe was staggering. 3,752 German aircraft were shot down in the air. 3,315 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 86,000 freight cars were destroyed. 9,000 locomotives destroyed. 60,000 armored vehicles destroyed. 68,000 trucks destroyed. 60,000 horse-drawn carts destroyed. In the Pacific, 697 Japanese aircraft were shot down in the air. 150 aircraft were destroyed on the ground. 1,500 vehicles were destroyed. 150 locomotives were destroyed. And countless ships, barges, and facilities were razed to the ground. The 9th Air Force alone flew 213,873 sorties, dropped 120,000 tons of bombs, fired 135 million .50 caliber rounds, launched 60,000 rockets, achieved a 4.6 to 1 advantage in aerial combat, and became the Allied fighter bomber with the lowest loss rate of the war. The most painful reality, however, was not the loss of aircraft, but the loss of pilots. On the Western Front, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 28,000 pilots. Most of these were in planes shot down by the P-47's intense machine gun fire. By the end of the war, the average German pilot had 30 hours of combat flight experience. The average P-47 pilot had 200 hours of combat experience. This was no longer war. It was a winning formula. One side was being destroyed. The other was constantly rebuilding. Years passed after the war ended, and former enemies began to meet at conferences, memorial ceremonies, and pilot reunions. At one such reunion, held in Phoenix, Arizona in 1985, German and American pilots came face to face. Here, Generalleutnant Adolf Galland, former commander of the Luftwaffe fighter wing, was asked about the P-47. Galland turned to the camera, took a deep breath, and spoke more openly than ever before. In 1943, we saw a big, clumsy plane and laughed. We said, the Americans don't understand fighter planes. But actually, we were the ones who didn't understand. Then he continued. He summed up both the war and his own mistakes in one sentence.
The Americans didn't try to build a European-style fighter plane. They built an American-style fighter plane, an aircraft based on power, firepower, and durability. However, what surprised Galland when he flew the P-47 for the first time after the war was how many of those planes the U.S. could actually produce. He was stunned by its physical power. He described its climb as shocking. He really liked the cockpit's spaciousness and visibility. He noticed that the controls were precise but safe. He described its durability by saying, "It's like sitting inside an armored shell." However, what impressed Galland most about the Thunderbolt was the aircraft's performance and how many of them could be produced in the country. His famous statement, "We never faced such power before. We never stood a chance." And before he spoke his final words, the room fell completely silent. That single line explained the fate of a country, an army, a war. The P-47 didn't defeat the Luftwaffe. It destroyed it. The Thunderbolt's design was the very essence of American engineering. Power, extreme durability, high firepower, easy maintenance, perfect suitability for mass production. The wing spars carried 40,000 pounds, 3 times the weight of the aircraft. The engine mounts withstood 12 G forces. The weapon system rarely caused any trouble. And after the war, this sound remained most vivid in his memory. The sound of the P-47s. That deep, rhythmic, sledgehammer-like sound when 8 Browning guns fired simultaneously. The Germans even gave it a name, Roosevelt's piano. It was the shortest sentence in a German pilot's interrogation report. In the most difficult moments of his life, usually after crying over the heavy losses in his fighter squadron, he wrote pages filled with this one sentence. The trail the Thunderbolt left in the sky resembled the Americans' 250-pound crepe de chine pieces only in the sun. Once you hear that sound, you never forget it. Most of those who heard it never made it home. When the P-47 Thunderbolt entered the war, it was a laughingstock, a clumsy, heavy aircraft dismissed as a flying milk jug. But by the end of the war, it had become a destructive machine both in the air and on the ground. The factors that brought about this transformation were the deadly firepower of 8 Browning machine guns, a massive turbo-supercharged engine, an almost indestructible fuselage, and the relentless American production capacity. In April 1943, German pilots mocked the Thunderbolt. By May 1945, not a single German pilot remained to be mocked. The sky had thundered, and the sky now belonged to America.